to welcome second lecture. Are we expecting any more people, or is this likely to be right?
Maybe one or two.
So it's not, shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you, were you all here the last day I was here? Yeah. So what I want to do today is really build on the issues that we looked at the last day. So we looked at first the reform of state enterprises. And we put forward three sort of ways in which we could look at this. The first one was we said we could look at it from an agency perspective, which was really viewing the state as a principal and the management of state-owned agency, state-owned enterprises as agents. We said we could also look at it from a resource perspective, and that involves taking a fuller sort of view of state enterprises, recognizing their political competencies, their managerial competencies, and the skills of their employees. And we said there was a third area that we could look at, which was the sort of the political economy area, and sort of looking at the various vested interests, both political and economic, that influence the state sector in China. And to look at these, as ways of trying to figure out, either why the reform of the state sector has been so slow in some areas and successful in others. So we said that these were sort of three areas that we could look at to help explain the state sector. What I want to do today is to actually apply this to a specific sector, and to take a type of case study approach. And I suppose the reason for doing a case study is to allow you to actually look at a sector or an industry in China and to see how these reforms play out, to see the difficulties in reforming the sector, to see the advantages the sector has, and in some ways to make up your own mind about some of the issues that are quite topical at the moment in terms of reforming China's political system, in terms of reforming the governance of state sector, etc., etc. So the sector I'm going to look at is going to be the oil sector, and in particular the petrochemical sector. I suppose there are a number of reasons why that sector makes a very good case study of what's happening in China at the moment. The first, I suppose, is that after 1978, when China switched to this open door policy, and it allowed manufacturing, saw a real expansion of the manufacturing sector. The type of products that were being produced, things like textiles, manufactured goods, computer parts, electronics, the base component for all of these products are petrochemical products. Okay, so generally, if you go down to the bottom of these products and see what is the major input, it's some form of chemical, it's some form of plastic, it's some form of synthetic product, and all of these have their roots in petrochemicals. So the petrochemical sector was a very, very important sector. The second reason is that it has always been very close to the political system. So the oil sector in China generally has been one of the sort of strategic sectors of the economy. So politically, it's always been very close to the leadership. So it's a very good example of a sector that has had to sort of, it's always been politically, strategically significant. The third reason why it's good to look at, why it's a good example, is the global economy. Okay? So most of you will know, I presume, if you have cars or if you drive around, you know that the price of fuel is a contentious issue for everybody. And sitting here in Southampton, we also know that there's very little that we can do about the price of fuel. It's an international issue. And for China, it's much the same, because even though it became, during the 1960s and 1970s, it became a major producer of oil, after economic reforms and after opening up, it had to import a lot of oil. So the oil price, the international oil price, became a major issue for the Chinese government, for the economy, and for the oil sector itself. Because if you think about it, you know, although a lot of sectors of the Chinese economy were, prior to 1978, closed off from the outside world, in the oil sector, they always knew what the world price was. So they always had a very good idea of how efficient they were, or as the case may be, if they weren't being efficient. The international oil price always provides a very good benchmark of efficiency. So although they were closed off to a certain extent, they knew what was going on in the outside world, either as an oil exporter, and later in the 1980s and 1990s as an oil importer. Okay? So we can say that, you know, across a number of issues, the state sector, both politically, economically, and globally, the oil sector is a very interesting one to look at when we look at China's state enterprise reforms. Okay. So the major questions that we want to look at when we look at that sector, the first one is to, in a sense, draw on what we did in the last lecture and say, well, you know, what are the critical resources of state enterprises? And in particular in the oil sector, what are the critical resources or the special sort of resources that the oil sector had? Okay. So we're looking at things like their political experience, their management experience, the physical resources, the technologies. All of these issues could potentially count. Their employees, you know, all these issues count as sort of critical resources of state enterprises. The second one is, in a sense, how are these affected by global market pressures? So, you know, opening up after 1978, how does that affect these resources? So, whereas before 1978, we might say that a lot of these political type skills, bureaucratic type skills, sort of top-down, administratively organized enterprises, this was an important advantage. Maybe after 1978, it wasn't such a big advantage. What is the role of the state in its institutions? So when we look at the political economy of state enterprise reform, what is the role of state institutions in that? What are the mismatches and ambiguities in the state resources? You know, and again, that goes back to the question of whether the sort of political advantages and the political resources that it had, you know, is there a mismatch between these and what's demanded under a market economy? And finally, we'd like to look at, you know, are the market sort of reforms that are still being talked about for the state sector, are these feasible given what we've looked at? Okay, so what I want to start by doing really is before we look at China's oil sector specifically, is to look at the global oil sector and say, or the global oil industry, and say, well, you know, aside from China, how has that evolved generally? And are there some lessons for China that we can look at from that? So I think most people again will know that if you look at the global oil industry generally, it's dominated, or tends to be dominated by a few very large oil majors. Okay? And these are controversial, you know, these are often controversial to some extent, but, you know, in a sense, people or governments seem to have accepted that there is some advantage to having major oil companies coordinate this industry. So if we look at their operations, or if we look at the growth of the oil industry generally, we can say that, you know, it has been driven by the growth of very large firms, very large multinational enterprises, or MNEs. Okay. And, you know, their effect on the welfare of the societies that they operate in is quite important. It's quite important to understand how that works in practice. From a developing economy perspective, as in the case of China. We could say, well, what do MNEs offer, or multinational enterprises, what do they offer China in the oil sector? Well, one of the big things is this sort of area of exploration technology and refining capacity. So these are the two issues that a developing economy is typically short of. The first one is the technology to explore for a while, and the second one is the refining capacity to actually, once you've got the oil out of the ground, the capacity to refine it into petrochemical products that are suitable for industry. If you look at the history of the industry, you can say, well, the advantage of large multinational corporations is that they have been typically very happy to do this for developing economies. Of course, there's a cost. And one of the paradoxes of this is that they've generally been happy to do it relatively cheaply, but the condition is that they get the right to supply crude oil to the country that they operate in. And this is where the whole welfare issue comes in, because if a large multinational corporation supplies you technology in return for supplying you the crude oil from that exploration, it means they have the right to set the price, which means there's a knock-on effect on economic welfare or well-being of citizens in that country. So in a sense, giving multinational companies the right to explore and the right to provide technology has generally been associated with giving them the right to set prices in the country that they operate. How do they do that? Well, they generally do this under a sort of integrated structure, which basically involves them taking oil out of the ground, processing it into petrol, diesel, petrochemical products, all this sort of area, under a sort of integrated company structure. So they get to control the whole process and set the price. This is all very fine in theory, but in practice, as you know, the sort of price of oil and its effect on both the competitiveness of industry in developing economies and the price of fuel for people in that economy, how it influences inflation, if the government or the state can no longer control the price and regulate the price, that obviously has a huge bearing. Okay. The question for countries like China, setting out on this is, what happens if you decide, well, we would rather not have this model, we would rather have a different model, where you sort of internalize some of these benefits, or you keep control over the setting of the price, the production, etc., etc. So, if you look at how the sector, or how the industry has evolved generally, you could say that, looking at this, in 1949, the Chinese state was faced with a bit of a dilemma. If you decide not to allow international multinational enterprises, it means that you obviously forego the exploration technology, you forego the refining capacity. In other words, you have to build all that internally. Okay? The advantage of it is that you keep control over the price. Okay? Again, what effect did this development have on the structure? Because if we want to know something about, why state enterprises in China today are structured in the way that they are, why are they large? Why are they very big? Why are they very difficult to reform? Well, if you look at the structure of the global oil industry, you could say, well, it's not so surprising. Okay, so in a sense, if a very good source on the sort of evolution of this structure is someone we touched on last week as well, which is Edith Penrose, who sort of did a study of the Standard Oil Company in the US and how it evolved after World War II. And she argues that really the structure of this industry, it didn't emerge by accident or good luck in exploration, or the companies didn't just strike it lucky. It emerged almost by design. Okay. in a sense that the big oil companies had the capital, they had the technology to develop the oil industry of developing economies. So in a sense, they were always going to be the global leaders in this industry. Okay? And in doing that, they benefited from government policies favourable towards the development of very large, what we call oligopolistic firms. In other words, firms that had highly dominant positions in developing countries. So she argues, in a sense, that really this structure as we have it today emerged almost by design. It wasn't through good-looking exploration, it wasn't through their perseverance or any of this thing. It was, in a sense, by political design. Okay? And again, if we go back to China's situation in 1949, looking at this, it's sort of saying it's telling them a clear blueprint as to what their oil sector should look like in future. So, turning to China's oil industry and in a sense, looking at the sort of background to it, well, if you don't choose the global model, which was allowing large oil majors into your country, well, what do? Well, obviously the opposite of all this is an emphasis on domestic techniques such as the Dajing method, self-reliance over foreign involvement, the use of labour over scarce capital, political education over material incentives. In other words, the whole idea of self-reliance, working in the national interest, placing a large degree of emphasis on on motivation, political education, lessening the material incentives, using a lot of labour as opposed to capital, which is not readily accessible, pioneering domestic techniques. Instead of importing international technology, you develop techniques domestically that are suited to your industry. Okay. The problem with all of this is that, in a sense, it gets things done, and I'll just show you. If you look at what China actually achieved during this period, if you look at its output of crude oil in 1949, you can see from this chart that it was about 0.12 million tons, which is a very, very small level of output. 1952, 1957, it was still quite small, 1.46 billion tons. By 1960, it had increased it to 5 billion tons, and doubled that again by 1965, trebled that amount by 1970, and then by 1978, it was producing about 104 million tons of crude oil a year, which is quite a significant amount. And that actually that sort of rapid increase in the production of crude oil actually brought China into the sort of the group of countries, that were considered oil majors. So, although it wasn't the standard model and it sort of deviated from what was done internationally, it was quite effective. And you can see that particularly if you look at the levels of increases in other areas of energy, such as coal, natural gas. Oil was one of the standout achievements of the sort of pre-1978 economy. How did it do that? Well, as we said, it relied on this issue of self-reliance, and there was a lot of, during the period, there was the Iron Man, Wang Junzi, he was sort of regarded as the Iron Man of China's oil industry, and motivation for other workers in the oil industry. He was sort of part of this discovery of Dajing, the oil field. And the Communist Party tended to use motivational figures like this to sort of motivate people, to say, well, look at this guy, a model worker, use his sort of manpower to discover a whole oil field and motivate, a lot of labour into doing it. So this Dajing oil field, it came on stream in about 1960, and in a sense it was responsible for a lot of the output increases that China achieved during this period. The downside of this was that, despite all this motivation, despite all this plea for, greater efficiency, greater demands on labour, it didn't necessarily improve efficiency. So while output did increase, the efficiency of the oil wells was actually quite low. A lot of the oil was quite high in sulfur. It required a lot of China's sort of scarce water resources to get it out of the, sort of pump it out of the ground. And it wasn't clear at what cost this was being done at, okay? So it didn't necessarily lead to an improvement in efficiency. And the technology, again, was domestically pioneered. A lot of it was based on Soviet technology, which after the 1960s and the Sino-Soviet dispute was no longer available. So China started to fall behind in terms of its exploration technology, its refining technology. It didn't find any new oil wells, so it was sort of limited in terms of new oil resources that it could find. So in a sense, although it increased production, it didn't improve efficiency. It was also the whole issue of oil, the whole question of oil was surrounded with politics. So Zhou Enlai, set this target in the 1960s, for China to become essentially self-sufficient in oil. It did that throughout the 1960s. It increased production and became almost self-sufficient. Deng Xiaoping, when he was rehabilitated in 1975, one of the first things he did was sort of stress the importance of oil exports as a way of earning more and more foreign currency for China. So China moved to this position of becoming an oil exporter and was actually earning quite substantial revenues from oil. But at the same time, while this was happening, I think developments like the emergence of the Gang of Four in the 1970s, they argued that in a sense Deng Xiaoping was squandering China's oil resources, that he was selling out to foreign countries. So there still was a lot of politics over the sector. After 1978, it became even more of an issue because the growth of, as we said before, the growth of manufacturing and the reform of the agricultural sector, these created even more demands for petrochemical products. Okay? So as we said, manufacturing requires chemicals, it requires synthetic products, it requires petrol, it requires diesel. The same with agriculture, the mechanization, the modernization of agriculture requires a lot of diesel, a lot of oil products. So all of these issues put further pressure on what was, under Zhou Enlai, it was essentially, self-reliance was emphasized. Under Deng Xiaoping, it was exporting oil. In a sense, economic growth itself after 1978 placed even more pressure on this. So, moving towards today, well, what has China got today after all of this? Well, we can say it's got three broad sectors. You can look at the upstream sector, which is the part that explores for oil. You've got the downstream sector, which is essentially the part that refines the oil, and you've got the offshore sector, which is the one that sort of drills in offshore in a sense. Okay. And these are dominated by three major companies. You've got Sinopec, PetroChina, and CNOOC, which is, and you can almost divide them by upstream, downstream, and offshore. So Sinopec is mainly in charge of the downstream bit, PetroChina, the upstream exploration bit, and CNOOC does the offshore bit. Okay. It's quite geographically dispersed in the sense that the sort of the issues that sort of came from the pre-reform economy. So the emphasis on developing the sort of oil fields in Dalian, which is in Heilongjiang province in the north. Economic growth took off in the south, which meant that a lot of the producing side of the sector was located in northern China and northeast China, whereas where economic growth was coming from was down in southern China, the sort of coastal provinces. So this meant, in a sense, that although the policies of the pre-reform economy, which sort of emphasized industrial areas to the north, the post-78 policies tended to emphasize manufacturing growth in the south, which meant that the oil sector was essentially in the wrong part of the country. And that, in a sense, to get the products from the north to the south required the development of infrastructure, the development of transport links, which previously weren't required. Okay? Alongside that, a lot of the refineries and smaller oil fields were sort of widely scattered. So again, these created transportation and infrastructural issues. And I suppose the economic growth of China itself created this huge mismatch between what was supplied by state producers and what was actually demanded by the market itself. So if you look at the statistics, recently, demand rose on average, but demand for crude oil rose on average by about 6% a year over the period 2006 to 2011, whereas domestic supply only grew about 2% a year over the same period. So on average, every year, the demand for oil products was growing faster than they could supply domestically. Okay? And that has implications for, when we look back at the policies that were followed prior to 1978, and this emphasis on self-sufficiency, which is in a sense, very strong today. How can you be self-sufficient when you're demanding much more than you can produce domestically? Okay. It also, if China still has this wish to export oil, well, if you can't produce enough domestically, how can you justify remaining an exporter? Okay. So these were some of the challenges that the growth of the sector faced. More recently, we have this issue of, the oil sector itself. It's no longer just about demand and supply. It's also about, what effect does the sector have on the environment, and in particular with the growth in demand for cars in cities and in rural areas. How does China achieve cleaner fuel, particularly if it's going to rely mostly on domestic technology to do this? So, an example might be that, current regulations allow sulfur content in petrol to be about 150 parts per million, okay? Which, if you compare to European regulations, which are about 10 parts per million, you can see the sort of challenges of the technology that's required, in a sense, to get from 150 parts per million down to 10 parts per million, which would be a sort of an acceptable standard. So, it does face a lot of challenges, and a lot of these can be related to, in a sense, the way the sector has evolved, both in terms of policies that emphasize self-sufficiency, the limited use of foreign technology, the limited use of foreign capital, and the sort of demand for China to be an oil exporter. What effects have these had on? Well, one of the surprising effects is that it's, in a sense, no longer become efficient for China to actually buffer the domestic market against global prices. So, up to the 1990s, it was able to, in a sense, offer subsidies to people who would be affected by rising fuel prices. the extent that it's become an importer of oil from the rest of the world has meant that, in a sense, that's no longer feasible to do. And in effect, what's happened is that actually China has become one of the lowest subsidizers among developing nations. It's become one of the lowest subsidizers of fuel. The statistic there, I think it's from, I don't know where that's from, but essentially it reduced its subsidization from about $27 billion a year in 2007 to about $7 billion in 2010. So it's been quite dramatically reducing the extent to which it's been subsidizing oil and fuel. So who pays for this? Well, somebody has to pay for it, obviously. And it seems at present that it's the state-owned refiners who are essentially being forced to absorb the costs of adjustment. Okay? So in a sense, China imports oil at international market prices.